This video will be about multiplying and dividing rational numbers. So there's a couple of rules we need to know when we're multiplying. If we have 0 times anything, so I'm going to use x to represent any number. Well, 0 times anything is still 0. -1 times anything, again I'm going to use x to represent anything, is just the opposite of that number, so negative x. So this one, if it was -1 times 5, we'd get -5. And +1 times anything doesn't change it at all, it just stays the same. So 1 times 327 is still just 327. So the second set of rules we need to know for multiplying is that when you have a positive number times a positive number, that will come out positive. A negative number times a negative number will also come out positive. A positive times a negative will come out negative. And a negative times a positive is also a negative. So now that we know the rules, we can do some multiplication. We're still working with our rational numbers, which are integers, fractions, decimals that stop, or decimals that repeat. Let's say we have 5 times -2.1. We know it's a positive 5 and a -2.1, so that means our answer should come out as negative. Then we multiply. 5 times 2.1 is 10.5. You may use a calculator, or you may do it by hand. If we had 2.1 times 5, we have 5, we carry the decimal. 5 times 2 is 10, so that's where 10.5 comes from. We can also do our multiplication with fractions. Now when we're multiplying fractions, we do need both things to be a fraction. Right now, -4 is not a fraction. You can actually make any number, any whole number, into a fraction by placing it over 1. So instead of writing just -4, I'm going to write -4 over 1 times the -2 over 3. And now you can multiply it out. When you multiply your fractions, you go numerator to numerator. -4 times -2 is +8. And denominator to denominator. 1 times 3 is 3. Now if you do need to change this to a mixed number, we can do old school division. 3 goes into 8 2 times. 2 times 3 is 6. So we have a remainder of 2. That means as a mixed number, this would be 2, because it went in 2 times. The remainder goes to the top part of the mixed numbers fraction, so 2 over, and then the denominator stays the same as 3. So 2 2/3. As with our addition and subtraction sections, they also want you to work with expressions. Expressions have numbers and letters. But they're going to tell you what numbers the letters represent. So we're going to say x is -4 and y is 7. So we go plug in for the letter x, -4, for the letter y, 7. When we go to multiply this out, this is not distribution because there's no plus sign in between. All we have to do is group the first two. 3 times 4 is 12. Then we involve the 7. 12 times 7 is 84. So you just have to multiply in order. So one thing that can be affected by multiplication is exponents, and negative numbers can be affected by exponents. So when we're looking at this situation, -2 to the 4th compared to -2 to the 4th. I said it the same way, but the second one has parentheses, the first does not. When there are no parentheses, the 4 is only affecting the 2 itself. That means the 4 is saying there's 4 2's, but not for negative signs. If there are parentheses, the 4 is affecting both the negative and the 2, so that means there's 4 2's and 4 negative signs. It won't always make a difference, but you can see in this case, if we multiply it out, negative 2 times 2 is negative 4. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. Negative 8 times 2 is negative 16. Now let's try this one. Negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. A negative times a negative is a positive. 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. And negative 8 times negative 2 is positive 16. So you do have to be careful with your negative signs and your exponents and knowing the difference between having a parenthesis and not. So the second thing in this section is division. Now division has some of the same rules as multiplication. So I'm going to go back to this first page. So this rule over here is not necessarily the same. 0 divided by x is 0. But if you do x divided by 0, that's a slight difference. You cannot do this. It does not exist. I'm going to get rid of the examples from before so I can write the rest of the division rules. Again, with division, order really matters. Negative 1 divided by x is a different thing than x divided by negative 1. X divided by negative 1 is just negative x, kind of like our multiplication. Negative 1 divided by x is a different situation, and it doesn't really have its own rule. Same thing with 1 divided by x, we don't really have its own rule for it, whereas x divided by 1 is just x. So, for example, negative 1 divided by 5, that's just the fraction negative 1 over 5, or if you want to switch it to a decimal, we could put it as negative 0.2. That's the most we can do with this one. Whereas if you have 5 divided by negative 1, that comes out as negative 5. But then the rest of the rules down here are the same for division. Positive divided by positive is still positive. Negative divided by negative is still positive. Positive divided by negative is still negative. Negative divided by positive is still negative. So let's do an example. 50 divided by negative 5. Positive 50, negative 5 comes out negative, and 50 divided by 5 is 10. You can also write it with a fraction bar. Fraction bars are just a form of division. So 50 divided by negative 5, still negative 10. Just a different way to write it. So again, you can work with expressions. Now we have more of our math operations to use. So in these expressions, we may have to remember how to do our order of operations. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Parentheses come first, exponents next, multiplication and division come next, and you go from left to right if there's a whole bunch of multiplication and division in order. Add and subtract come next, and again you go left to right if there's a whole bunch of addition and subtraction in order. With your parentheses, you do have to keep in mind that there can be invisible parentheses. There's things they assume you know just by the way it's written. For example, so we'll get back to this expression in a second. For example, if I had negative 2 plus 5 over 7. When you have this, they're assuming you know that there are really parentheses around the top part of this fraction. Anytime you have a fraction bar and there's addition or subtraction, let's change the bottom a little bit, 7 minus 1. Now that we have some subtraction on the bottom, there's parentheses around the bottom as well. That means you have to do what's on the top first. So negative 2 plus 5 is positive 3. 7 minus 1 is 6. Then you can worry about the division. So you might think addition last, except that there's really parentheses here that mean you have to do that addition first. 3 over 6, you would still have to reduce. Both of these divide by 3. 3 divided by 3 would be 1, and 6 divided by 3 would be 2. So back to our expression. A equals negative 10, B equals negative 2, and they will tell you these values. I had already chosen, but they really can be any values, so they have to tell you what they will be. And we plug them in. Negative sign from the expression. A is also negative, so this negative 10, we're going to put in parentheses, divided by, from the expression, B is negative 2. Since it's a negative sign, let's also put that in parentheses, plus 3, and then C is 4, so 3 times 4. So now we simplify. On top, a negative outside a negative makes a positive 10. Negative 2, that doesn't have anything to interact with yet, so we don't really need the parentheses. And 3 times 4, that would be 12. We can also do this division. 10 divided by negative 2 is negative 5. And now we can do our addition. Negative 5 plus 12 is 7. So the very, very last thing we can talk about with division is division with fractions. So we have 2/3 divided by negative 1 over 6. When you are dividing fractions, it kind of follows a funny pattern, and you just have to get this pattern memorized. You change the division symbol to multiplication, and then you use the reciprocal of the second fraction only. So the first fraction is going to stay 2/3. The second fraction would become negative 6 over 1. We flipped the numbers. Once you have it multiplication was just straight across for fractions. 2 times negative 6 is negative 12. 3 times 1 is 3. This time we can actually divide our fraction. Negative 12 divided by 3 comes out as negative 4. We didn't have to worry about reducing it because it divided. We didn't have to worry about changing it into a mixed number because it divided, which is a little bit nice when it does happen that way. So that concludes our discussion of multiplying and dividing rational numbers.